Hello and welcome to another episode of Doug Formative. This is going to be part 2 of the Garfield drawing that we started a couple days ago. Unfortunately, during the recording of me finishing the Garfield drawing, I established that my audio was messed up. So instead of re-recording and redesigning the entire second portion of the Garfield drawing, I would just do it as a speed drawing and then kind of walk you through the steps. And that way I'm limiting in this to about a half an hour instead of like an hour and 45 minutes, which is what it took to finish up the Garfield drawing. Alright, so let's go ahead and get this thing started. Alright, so one of the things that I established before I started up on this thing again is that there was a better way to recreate the stripes on the side of Garfield's head, and it's because of the way that they're shaped. The design that I had done before, it comes to a point at both ends, and then I realized that what I could do is if I turn those stripes into a path by selecting it with the selector tool, going to path and then object to path, and then grab your edit paths by nodes tool, I could recreate that shape as you can see here. And then if you selected that node that was on the bottom and then selected the button that's at the top that says make selected node smooth, it would allow you to create a curved bottom on that one shape. Then what you could do after you've gotten it to the same shape as what you see on the original Garfield drawing, then you could hold Control and hit D on it to duplicate it, shrink it down by holding Control and dragging any of those arrows on that duplicate that you created, and just make it the size and rotation that you would need to recreate the rest of those stripes. And then I figured I could just use that for all of the all of the remaining stripes on the side of his head and those couple that he has on his body. Right underneath the bottom of his chin. So I'm going to speed this up a little bit more while I'm recreating the rest of these stripes, and then I will walk you through what I did for the rest of this drawing. So the next thing I discovered was there was a way that I could create the outline of Garfield's body, but I still needed to maintain an orange shape that would overlap with the bottom of Garfield's head. So I had to duplicate that body shape by clicking on it, holding Control and hitting D on the keyboard, and then doing an outline by holding Shift and clicking on black on the palette. And then I needed to place that object that I just created all the way to the bottom by going up to the top menu and hitting the button that says lower selected object to bottom. And what that would do is it would give me the chance to have the outline where I needed it to be, but then I needed to increase the size of the outline so it matched the outline of his head. So I had to go to the fill and stroke menu and increase the size of it to, I believe it was 20 total. And then I proceeded to go up to the outline of his head, grab the Bezier pen by hitting B or selecting the Bezier pen on the tools menu. I had to change the drop down on the Bezier pen from clipboard to none, and that would give me a solid consistent line. So I could do that left side of his head and just drag it out until it was, closer to the middle of the bottom of his head, because it was going to be overlapped by his thumbs anyway. And then I needed to do the same thing on the right side of his head, as you can see. And then I took one of the stripes on the side of his head, just duplicated it, shrunk it down, and then adjusted the size of it to create that one line that's on his neck there. Then I duplicated it again, and then using the Edit Paths by Nodes tool, I turned it into a path first by going to Path, Object to Path, and then I just adjusted all these nodes, added a curve to it, and just moved it around until I was satisfied with the shape that I had, and that it was as close as I could get to the one on the original picture of Garfield. And then I started to recreate those whiskers that are coming out from the side of his head next to his eyes. So I used the Bezier pen again with from clipboard chosen, and then I turned it into a path by going to object and then a path and then object to path, and then just by adjusting these nodes I recreated that same shape where it kind of tapers off. It's kind of flat at the top towards the end, as you can see what I'm doing here. And then there was a lot of extra nodes in there that I didn't really need, so I just selected them and then deleted them. And then I continued to adjust that whisker shape, added a curve to it to try to match the original curve. And then I decided what I should do is just duplicate that whisker and recreate the rest of them. Rotate it as needed, and then adjust the spacing so they're about evenly spaced apart. That's what I was pointing out right there, is that they're like equally spaced apart. And then it was a little bit thicker towards the outline of his head, so I had to drag them in a little bit, just making sure that the point didn't overlap the outline of his head, because you definitely didn't want to see that. And then I selected all three of those whiskers that I created, held Control and hit D on the keyboard to duplicate them, then hit H on the keyboard to do the horizontal flip, and then dragged it over to place it on the opposite side of his head. The next step that I did was I wanted to recreate the line for each side of his upper lip, the bottom of his upper lip. So I grabbed the Bezier pen, making sure that from clipboard was selected, and then I made sure that the snapping was turned on. And then I started from the very middle of the bottom of his nose and just dragged a line out and continued on to, as you can see right there. And then grabbing the nodes tool, I dragged that line down and tried to match the curve of that yellow shape that I used for his upper lip. Using the handle tool to increase the thickness. And then because the yellow shape wasn't exactly placed where it should have been, I had to adjust that by using the nodes tool to click onto the yellow shape and then grabbing the handle and adjusting it so it fell underneath the black outline that I had just created. And then I had to follow that same process for the opposite side. And then I dragged those lines both over just so it looked like that they met right there in the very center of the bottom of his nose. And then I readjusted the yellow shape so it didn't stick out past the outline. So the next step that I did was recreate that little U shape that stuck out past that. So with the Bezier pen selected, I just dragged the line out that connected with that line that I just done, dragged it down with the Edit Paths by Nodes tool, and just try to make it look as smooth as possible. And then I had to make it thicker because it was a little bit too thin and it wasn't that noticeable when you had that the the Garfield drawing zoomed out. So I had to thicken that, and then what I did was I turned the line that was it was connected to into a path by going to path, object to path with it selected, and then I dragged that line out so it looked thicker all the way through instead of tapering to a point so abruptly. And then I had to do the same thing to the opposite side. And then I grabbed that shape that I had just created, that U shape, duplicated it, hit H on the keyboard to do a horizontal flip, and then adjusted the rotation and placed it on the opposite side so it looked just like it does on the first one that I did. The next step was to create those triangle shapes. Actually, no. I traced the outline of that round shape that he has on his mouth. So I drew another line using the Bezier pen. Made sure that it was thick enough. And then it used those handles that you get whenever you adjust the line shape or the line curve. And then I had to make that adjustment because I noticed that the line was thicker where it connected to his eye, and then it came to a point at the bottom. And then I duplicated it, hit H to horizontal flip, clicked again to get the rotation handles, and then just made sure that I matched the shape of that the other side of his mouth. And then there's that other shape that comes off of the bottom of that, so I duplicated one of those stripes that I had at the bottom of his neck, or towards his neck by his chin, and just recreated that shape, trying to duplicate that curve that it had. And then I noticed that the point on that other line needed to come a little bit closer to his mouth, so that's what I did there. And then I duplicated that same shape, dragged it over to the opposite side, and just followed suit. So the next step that I had to do was recreate those triangle shapes that are on the corners of his mouth. The first step that I tried to do was use the polygon or stars tool that you see over on the left hand menu, but then when I tried to do the scaling on it, it just kept acting funny. Like it as you can see here, like I couldn't just subtly adjust the size and shape of it, so I had to go through a different process to recreate a triangle shape. So I grabbed the square tool, make a perfect square by holding control and dragging the square out to 45-degree angle, and then you recreate another square, and then you scale it up so it's wider than the shape of the diamond shape, if you want to call it a diamond, and just making sure that it is above where those two corners are. So I had to do it over because I kind of went in backwards order. So I had to create the diamond shape first by creating the square, holding control, getting the rotation handles and making it into a diamond, then duplicating it, creating the square shape, and then I scaled it up just like that, making sure that the top line of that square was above where those two side corners are. Hold shift, click on the diamond shape, then go to path and then select difference, or hit control shift minus on the keyboard, and then you get your diamond shape. And then if you click on it again and with the side scaling handle, then you can drag that in to make the triangle shape that you need, and then click on it again to get the scaling handles, and then scale it down to the size that you need, and then drag it into the corner of his mouth over there, rotate it the way that you need it to be, and then just make whatever subtle adjustments. I selected all 3 of them, and then you just make sure that you don't have anything else selected besides those 3 triangles. Hold Control and hit D to duplicate it, and then drag it over to the opposite side. Rotate it as you need to. And then the next step was, I believe the next step that I did was to create that the countertop or table, whatever you want to call it. So I created a square shape that would be the background behind him by grabbing our squares in rectangles tool, holding Control and dragging it out at a 45-degree angle so it was perfectly squared, and just centered it the way that I wanted to. And then with it selected, I hit the lower selection to bottom on the top menu so it's behind the Garfield that we've created so far. Then I created another rectangle shape with the snapping enabled, so it would snap exactly to that square shape that I just created. And then hitting D on the keyboard, I grab my dropper tool to make sure that that table is the same color blue as in the original drawing. Then I grabbed my Bezier pen, and making sure that from clipboard wasn't selected, that there was none that was selected from the drop down menu, I drew a line that was the outer line for the top of the counter there. Then I dragged and selected over the entire thing and lowered the opacity about halfway, because the next step was to create his hands, and I wanted to make sure that I could see them clearly over the top of Garfield's face and body. So the next step was to create 3 different ellipse shapes. One small, one a little bit bigger for the middle, and then I duplicated that left one and dragged it over to act as the right one. And then I went to Path and hit Union, so they're all one shape. And then I grabbed my dropper tool, clicked on the original Garfield to make sure that the colors were correct. Then with the selector tool, I went over to, or I held shift and clicked on black on the palette, and that way I could get that black outline. And then I adjusted the pixels to 13, so it was the appropriate outline width. Then I turned that into a path by going to Path, Object to Path, grabbed my Edit Paths by Nodes tool, and then I started adjusting the shape of his arms, as you can see here. And then I had to recreate that object, but without the outline. So with that selected, I held Control D, and then I held Shift and clicked on the X on the bottom left of the palette to get rid of the outline, and then I scaled it up just a little bit. And the reason I had to do that was because in order to create his thumbs and then that bottom finger, I needed to be able to drag those up and make sure that they overlapped the original outline that I just created with his hands with those 3 circles. Now this entire process that I'm doing right here, I ended up having to redo because I realized that you didn't have the original, the curve of the top of his hands. It just went from his arms to his thumbs. So I had to start completely over. But you know what? It was a lesson learned. You know, I don't think of any of this stuff, you know, anytime that I mess up and, you know, while I'm working on these things, it's like I'm learning as I'm teaching. And if, you know, it's not a failure if I screw up. It's really just I learned how not to do something. And something that I've kind of learned within the past year is if you go through life being afraid to fail, then you're doing it all wrong. But if you realize that there is no such thing as failing, there's succeeding, or there's learning how not to do something, then there's no failing. And as long as you try, then there's nothing to worry about. And I think that's one of the best outlooks on life that anybody could possibly have. You know, as long as you're making an effort towards what it is that you're trying to achieve, you know, you have the goals that you want to work towards, and you're actually taking the steps to achieve those goals, then you're doing it right. And if you do something that doesn't help you achieve those goals, then you just learned how not to do it. And then you just try something different. You don't try something different, you do something different. And if that doesn't work, then you learned another way not to do it. But you just keep on pushing. And that's it. That's probably the best advice that I can give to anybody. So here I am, learning the wrong way to recreate Garfield's thumbs here. And eventually I'll realize that, whoa, I screwed up. And his hands aren't there, so I had to undo all that stuff that I just did. And here I am, starting again. So with that orange object selected, I had to create another node in between those two and the other side. Click and drag that up, click and drag the other side up. And then I could recreate those thumbs, but I'd still have that the top part of his hand on either side. And then I made all the adjustments that I needed to make sure that it looked like it was curving, you know, outward, starting from the bottom. I had to move that node up because I noticed that there was an overlap from his left thumb over his right thumb. Anatomically, his left thumb. But if you're looking at the screen, it would be the thumb on the right side of the screen. So what I did was I created a line using the Bezier pen. Created a node in the middle of that, the 2 points, the 2 end points, dragged that up to be the top of his thumb. And then I grabbed the handle to thicken that line there. And then adjusted the curve to match the shape of his thumb. Then I did the same thing on the opposite side. Adjusted the thickness, adjusted the curve. You know, and there was a couple times where I had to click on the orange shape with the nodes tool selected, so I could drag that out. And then I had to bring the thumb down. And then eventually what I realized was that the thumbs were too long. You know, if you look at the both of them, my thumbs were way too long compared to the original. And I ended up having to drag over the entire thing, drag that up because it wasn't up high enough. And then I selected the yellow shape, held shift and clicked on those top 3 nodes, and then just held control and clicked and dragged them down. And then I had to follow suit with the outline. And now as you can see, the thumbs are shorter. And then the other thing that I noticed was the top of the thumbs looked way too flat. So I had to grab the nodes tool again, turn those nodes into a corner instead of the flat top, so I could make them look more rounded. And that way it looked a lot more natural. You know, a lot more like the original drawing. And then I had thickened the line there where the one thumb was being overlapped by the other. Now I had to recreate that his other fingers, and it's one solid like curving shape. So what I did was, actually no, I recreated his other finger, his bottom finger, because that was a whole separate entity. So with the nodes tool, I dragged the bottom of that orange shape, that orange circle there. Pulled that down, adjusted the size and curve of it, and then I had to recreate that line using the Bezier pen. So I grabbed the Bezier pen, hitting B on the clipboard, created that one line, thickened it up, and then just dragged it around to match the shape of that outline that I had just done. Then I turned it into a path by going to path and then object to path, and then I had to adjust the thickness of that line, and then I noticed that the left side needed to be brought up a little bit further, adjusted the thickness, and then adjusted the curve so it overlapped that other part of the outline of Garfield's hand there. Alright, now the next step was to recreate the other fingers, but I actually messed up during this part because with the Bezier pen selected, I still had from clipboard selected, and what that ended up doing was it caused the line to be way too thick in the middle instead of being a consistent outline shape or thickness throughout. As you can see, it comes to a point at the end, and then it's like really thick towards the middle, and it just didn't look enough like the original drawing. But you know, I still worked with it, and I didn't realize it like right away. You know, but when I turned all those nodes into smooth nodes, and then I started adjusting it, then it started to become more obvious that this was not going to work. You know, I played around with it. I tried to get the fingers to look exactly like the original drawing, but it didn't work. All that effort that I made. And you know, that's why it took a lot longer to redo this second part than the first part, is because I figured out a better way to do it, and then I had to delete it and then start over. So I had all this issue with extra nodes that I had to like click on and delete and try to adjust that line, and that one wasn't working. There was like a bunch of extra nodes there. And every time I deleted it, it just warped that shape, which is really frustrating. So once again, there's still just extra nodes. Instead of it just coming to a point like it should have, it had this weird curve at the end, almost like a figure eight. You know, I turned that one into a path and increased the thickness of that line. You know, I did the same to that, but then it didn't look right, because I would have had to sit there and adjust every single node to make sure that that line was more of a consistent thickness. It was just way too thick in the middle compared to the rest of it, and this was right about the time that I discovered that, so that's why I dragged it down. I grabbed the Bezier pen again, and then I changed that drop down menu to none instead of from clipboard, recreated that same shape that I had before, adjusted the width to 13 pixels instead of millimeters, and then I think it was too thick, so I changed it to 9. And then I went through that same entire process. I selected every single node except for the two end nodes. So I just clicked on the one, held shift, and then clicked on all the rest of them. And then I clicked on the button that says make selected nodes smooth, so it was more of a curvy shape. And then I went through that whole process, making these adjustments with the handles, turned the nodes smooth that I needed to, so they weren't corners. I just tried to make that look as consistent as possible. And then once I was satisfied with the shape of the fingers, then I turned that line into a path by going stroke to path, and then stroke to path. And then I just deleted one of those nodes on the edge to make that line come to a point. But then the entire rest of that line was a consistent width. I dragged over the entire thing to select it to bring the opacity all the way up. And then the last step that I had to do was create the shadow. So I just grabbed the Bezier pen, made sure snapping was enabled, snapped onto the edge of his arm, then clicked on black, held shift, clicked on the X to get rid of the outline, then grabbed my edit paths by nodes tool by hitting F2, and then just recreated that curve. And then I did the same exact process for these other areas. Just drag the outline around to make sure I was satisfied with the shape of the shadow. And there's just that one last one, making that a rounder shape. And then I zoomed out on it, and then the last step was just to make that background white instead of gray. So selected the background and then just clicked on white in the palette, and then that was it. You know, that was the last step, and I think it came out pretty good compared to the original drawing. So that's how I did it. If you're enjoying my videos, don't forget to subscribe right here. Also, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook so you can share it with your friends. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.